Joseph M. Bessette is Alice Tweed Professor of Government and Ethics at Claremont McKenna College and Senior Research Fellow at the Claremont Graduate University. He received his BS in Physics from Boston College and his MA and PhD in Political Science from the University of Chicago. Dr. Bessette is the author or co-author of numerous books, including The Mild Voice of Reason, Deliberative Democracy and American National Government, American Government and Politics, Deliberation, Democracy, and Citizenship, and By Man Shall His Blood Be Shed, A Catholic Defense of Capital Punishment. Co-editor and contributor to The Presidency and the Constitutional Order, The Constitutional Presidency, and the Imperial Presidency and the Constitution, and editor of Toward a More Perfect Union, The Writings of Herbert J. Story. Please welcome Joseph Bessette.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'll talk a little bit about how we're going to deal with the technical glitches that have come up here in the last few minutes. But first, let me just say it's a great pleasure for me to be here. This is my first visit to Hillsdale. I have been a big fan of this institution and an avid reader of, is it Imprimis or Imprimis, whichever it is, you know what I'm talking about, for more than three decades. I have seen good friends, former colleagues, and students find their way into your community and make their own distinctive contribution to the continuing and growing excellence of this outstanding institution. So I'm very honored to be asked to contribute to this program on foreign policy. Now, let me just say a word about the technical complications. So I had built my talk around PowerPoint slides with quotations from founding documents. I can see them right here, and I guess, but you can't see them behind me. Maybe before we're done, you'll be able to see them. So I'm going to make adjustments, but you will have to pay close attention. I'll have to read from these documents that you otherwise would be able to see. So it presents challenges for us, and we'll, of course, do the best we can with those challenges. I would be reading from them anyway, but I was hoping, obviously, you'd be able to see what I was reading. So anyway, we'll do the best we can, and I'm hopeful this will be successful. So the topic is separation of powers and foreign policy, but that's much too big a topic to try to cover in the next 30 or 40 or 45 minutes. Actually, I want to shut off my phone and also set it up for the time so I can see how the time is going by. I don't know if anyone else was going to stop me if I went too long, but anyway, I will try to self-regulate, but let me shut this off. Okay, all right, good. So I'm going to focus entirely on one aspect of separation of powers and foreign policy, which is the war power. So this is the aspect of foreign policy that I know best. This is what I've been studying and teaching, especially at the Claremont Graduate University over the past 30 years. I do some of my writing on. And in particular, I want to focus on this issue regarding the war powers. Who gets to decide whether to send American troops into combat on the high seas or in the skies above a foreign nation? Who gets to decide that? Is this mainly a matter for Congress to decide, or for the president, or for the two branches in a kind of collaborative effort? Or does the answer to this question simply vary case by case? And in particular, what guidance does the Constitution give us in trying to resolve who gets to decide whether to go to war, overseas, on the high seas, or in a foreign country? Many scholars view the Constitution as providing not much formal guidance, but merely that it creates an invitation to Congress and the presidency to struggle over foreign policy and over the war powers. And as I think you'll see, I don't agree with that view. I think the Constitution provides a lot more guidance than a lot of people, a lot of scholars give it credit for. So I want to lead you through some key materials, brief excerpts from 6 or 7 or 8 different founding documents, and then I won't have time in the formal presentation to apply what we learned from the founding documents to contemporary issues, but I am prepared to talk about the War Powers Act of 1973, which is not part of my formal address, prepared to talk about Reagan versus Obama's bombing of Libya, and whether what we're going to learn in the next half hour or so is relevant to try to determine whether they were constitutional or not. So I have some material prepared that might come up in the Q&A. So the documents that we're going to cover are the following. Obviously, the most authoritative is the Constitution itself. We're going to look at key provisions in the Constitution. We're going to look at one very brief debate on August 17th at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, the only debate that occurred on war powers that we have a record of. We're going to look at some very interesting features of the South Carolina Constitutions of 1776 and 1778. Then in my original plan, we were going to talk about a very different view of war powers in the Massachusetts Constitution, but I'm going to skip that, and maybe that'll come up in the Q&A. And then a little bit from Alexander Hamilton's Federalist 70 that some of you might be familiar with, about the need for a unitary executive. And then the most famous war powers debate of the founding era, which is, you may not have heard of this, and they use Latin synonyms, but it's Pacificus versus Helvidius, 1793. I'll explain it when we come to it. But Pacificus is Hamilton and Helvidius is Madison. So there's a big debate in the written newspapers of the time, in pamphlets and newspapers, although under these pseudonyms. But it quickly became known who was the author of each of these sets of essays. And then the very first Supreme Court case to take up the war powers was in 1800, and the name of the case was Bass v. Tingey. And there's a couple of paragraphs in that case that will be very helpful to us, I think are very useful to us in understanding the history and the contemporary issues about the application of the war power. So let's start with the Constitution. So we'll start with the Constitution on Congress and then the Constitution on the presidency. That's the order in which the branches occur in the Constitution. Article 1 is on Congress, Article 2 on the presidency. So you might be familiar with these provisions. So one of them is especially important, but let me just read the list of powers. So there's 18 powers in Article 1, Section 8, vested in the Constitution, vested in Congress by the Constitution. And some of them have to do with international relations and war matters. So what are those? First, to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations. And then the most important one for our purpose is to declare war. Congress has the power, as you all know, I'm sure, to declare war. Also to grant letters of marque and reprisal and make rules concerning captures on the land and water. I'll come back in a minute to this odd phrase, letters of marque and reprisal. Third, to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for longer than 2 years. So Congress typically has 1-year budgets, but it's prohibited from having, say, a 5-year budget to the Army because the Constitution authors didn't want the executive branch to have that much flexibility, 5 years worth of funding. But typically, Congress provides 1-year funding. Every year, they fund the military. And I won't say a lot about this in the talk, but one way in which Congress can combat a president who they think is out of control in terms of war powers is to deny the president funding. And maybe the most famous example of this is in June of '73, Congress passed a law that, so this is at the end of the Vietnam War period. There are no American combat troops in Vietnam, but the war is still going on, the South Vietnamese against the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. But the American troops have all been withdrawn. Congress passes a law saying after a certain date in August, no more money can be spent by the federal government for any military operations in Southeast Asia. That meant when in early January of 1775, a large army from North Vietnam flooded into South Vietnam, the U.S. was, the president then, Gerald Ford then, Richard Nixon earlier, was prohibited from providing any military assistance. So Congress can very much affect the war powers through funding. Congress provides and maintains a Navy. It makes rules and regulations of the land and naval forces, like Uniform Code of Military Justice, something Congress passes. It provides for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, to suppress insurrections, and to repel invasions. So Congress writes the law that determines how the president, it doesn't itself call the militia into service. The militia is what we call the National Guard. So there's a Michigan National Guard. I live in California. There's a California National Guard. And they're under the control of their governors unless they're nationalized, unless they're called into national service, which they sometimes are. And for one of three reasons, they can be called into national service: to execute the laws, to suppress insurrections, or to repel invasions. Now, I'm not going to talk about the use of the war power domestically. One of my favorite topics, I speak about it a lot, I teach about it a lot, is Lincoln's use of the war power during the Civil War. But Lincoln didn't think the Confederacy was another country, obviously. It was all one country. So that's purely domestic use. And that's not on my agenda for tonight's conversation. I'm just going to be talking about the exercise of war power vis-a-vis other countries or other international organizations like terrorist organizations. So those are the powers of Congress, but what the heck is a letter of marque and reprisal? I don't know if anybody here has ever heard the phrase. We don't use them anymore. Letters of marque and reprisal. So what they were letters that the sovereign would issue to a private citizen, typically someone who had a ship with guns, sometimes called privateers, a private person with a ship with guns, a little private military force, which if that private person with the ship with guns were to go out into the ocean and capture the goods off another ship, you would call that person a pirate, and they would be subject to being captured and summarily executed. But if they have one of these letters, the letter is a letter from the sovereign that authorizes that private person with the ship with the guns to act on behalf of the sovereign, like act as if he's part of the military of the sovereign. And therefore, if he's captured on the high seas doing something authorized by this letter, then he could be captured, but he would not be treated as a pirate. He'd be treated as a prisoner of war, and then at the end of the war would normally be repatriated. So, but notice, it's Congress that can issue these letters, not the president. Now we don't actually issue such letters anymore because countries have their own navies, but there was a time when sovereigns would issue such letters to private individuals to act on their behalf militarily. And that authority, interestingly, in the Constitution is given to the Congress, not the president. Now, let's talk about the president's authorities. So obviously the one that is maybe most at issue, or the one that you most think about, is the president is the commander-in-chief, right, of the Army and Navy of the United States, and of the militia if the militia is called into national service. He's always the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy. And now we have, of course, Air Force, and then the Marines are technically part of, as you might know, part of the Navy. He's always in command, the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy, but he's only in the commander-in-chief of the state militia when they're nationalized, when they're called into national service. So that's the one we always think of, but there are three other provisions of Article 2 that are very relevant to this constitutional issue of war powers. The first one is the beginning words of Article 2. So on my slide, everything on my slide, for those who might be viewing it elsewhere, these are all direct quotes from Article 2. And Article 2 begins, "The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America." Now, as we'll see in a few minutes, Hamilton thought that that clause itself gave over to the President essentially all of the foreign policy and war power, unless the Constitution made some exceptions. We'll see that argument in a few minutes. There's also the well-known clause that the President shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Now, normally we think of that as applying domestically, but it can also apply outside the United States. There are international treaties that the U.S. has. By the terms of the Constitution itself, treaties are part of the supreme law of the land. So the president presumably has some authority to carry out treaties, and maybe those treaties, carrying out those treaties, would have military implications. There's also international law. And under international law, American citizens on the high seas or in some other country should be treated in a certain way by other countries, and if they're mistreated, maybe the president under this clause can come to their aid in some way. And then finally, there's the oath of office. And you probably all know it, you've all heard it, you've probably all watched a presidential inauguration where the president publicly takes the oath of office. The end of it is that he solemnly promises or swear to the best of his ability. The end of it is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. You've all heard the phrase. Now, interestingly, and this is maybe not as well known, every other person who works for the federal government and every officer of a state or local government must also take an oath. But under the Constitution, all it says is they must take an oath to support the Constitution. Now, Congress actually writes out the words of the oath for everybody else. And so if you take it, I've taken it 4 or 5 times in my life. I took it first as a summer employee of the Post Office Department delivering mail in Brockton, Massachusetts for 2 summers when I was the age of the students in the room here. I had to take this more elaborate oath that many of you have heard, defend the country against all aggressors, foreign and domestic. I won't read it, but and then I worked in 2 different public positions in Cook County, Illinois, and then in the federal government. I had to take the oath again. But the Constitution only requires that the oath say you must support the Constitution. Unless you're the president, then it says you must promise to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. So the presidential oath is much more emphatic, right? To preserve, protect, and defend seems like a much greater responsibility than simply the obligation to support the Constitution. So maybe that can be the ground of war powers as well. And I'm not going to talk about Lincoln except to mention that Lincoln is the first president to use the oath of office as a grounding for exercising extraordinary war powers, but that was domestically during the Civil War. So this is what those provisions that I just went over, that's all that the first generation of American leaders, that's all they had in terms of how the Constitution divided up the war power. You may or may not know this, but the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, so the convention met from late May to September 17th. Just last week we had Constitution Day, right? That's September 17th. Hillsdale had a program in Northern Virginia that actually got national news as a result of people who spoke at that program. That was in celebration of Constitution Day. So the convention met, was 55 men, 42 were there at one time or another, 42 were present on the last day, September 17th, and 39 of those 42 signed the document. But they were sworn to secrecy. They met behind closed doors in a hot, humid Philadelphia summer. All the doors and windows were closed. They were sworn to secrecy, and for the most part, there were no leaks of any real consequence. It was a different time. 55 men could work on something for 3.5 months, and nobody leaked it, what was going on. It was really quite striking. You wonder today if that would be possible. Of course, if we had a new constitutional convention, it would almost surely be done in public, because that would just, the norm today would be not to give some number of men and women today the opportunity to write a new constitution and to do it secretly. So norms do change. In addition, there was no formal record of the resolutions and votes at the Constitutional Convention, which is called the Journal. There was a secretary who kept a formal record of every resolution and every vote. The voting was done by states. Every state got one vote, no matter how big in population or in territory. The Journal wasn't published until 1818, a couple of decades later. But the record of the debates, the best record of the debates, a few delegates took limited debates for a few days or a week or so, but James Madison, as you may know, who's sometimes called the father of the Constitution, which I think is an accurate term, although he's not really the father of the presidency. That's sort of another story. But he was appropriately termed later the father of the Constitution. James Madison, a delegate from Virginia, 36 years old, decided he would take a written record of all the debates for as long as the convention met. And he got a good seat in front, looking forward out at the others. You could hear everybody. And according to him, he didn't miss more than a few minutes for the whole 3.5 months. And he recorded something from every speaker. Now, it was still notes. It wasn't a transcript. He wasn't doing shorthand. But it's notes over the course of 3.5 months. And when you publish James Madison's notes, you get about 1,000 pages of printed material, these excerpts. So after Madison's notes were published after his death. He died in 1836, and his notes were published in 1840. So this is half a century after the event occurred. The nation finally had a record of what was said and argued during those 3.5 months. So the first generation of Americans who were governed by the institutions created in 1787, they had the actual words of the document, which I just showed you or described to you or read to you, but they had no information about the debates that produced those words. We now know, and have known since 1840, that war powers were debated at the convention for only one part of one day. This hugely controversial and important subject that has filled hundreds of volumes by academics and others, was actually debated at the Constitutional Convention for only one part of one day. And the day was August 17th, which was 1 month before they finished. They finished on September 17th. So I got the slide up, and I'm going to have to just read to you from some of the slide. But let me give you the background. So the convention started meeting in late May, and they look at some broad different plans, the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan. There's some great controversies. They pass a lot of resolutions. And at the end of July, they say, okay, we have to stop as a group now, the group of 55, and we've got to set up a committee. And it was a small committee of 5 to take everything that's been done, as well as some other plans that people have proposed. So a man named Charles Pinckney had proposed a plan, although it was not debated in those earlier first 2 months of the convention. So they gave everything they had passed and Pinckney's plan, some other stuff to this committee, and the committee produced over a 10-day period. So the convention went on recess, the full group, and the committee over a 10-day period produced what they call the draft Constitution. And they brought it to this main printer named Dunlap in Philadelphia, who had printed the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation, and they had him secretly produce 55 copies, no more, which they then passed out at the convention. And from the early August till September 17th, they worked through that draft Constitution. Then at the very end, they take everything they've done and they create another committee called the Committee of Style, which took everything they had done and put the final polish and form on the Constitution, right? That was right like the week before they finished up. So what this slide is showing, and I'll read you part of it, is they're working through the draft Constitution, which begins with Congress's structure and then Congress's powers. Then it goes to the president's structure and the president's powers. Then it goes to the court structure and the court's powers. They're working through line by line. On August 17th, and there's a long list of specific powers that the draft Constitution proposes vesting in Congress. We call it the enumerated powers, right? The enumerated powers of Congress. And one of them is the power, quote, to make war. All right, that's all it says, the power to make war. There's a debate then that occurs. If you just read this at a normal pace, it takes under 3 minutes. I did it a couple times just to check, under 3 minutes. If you look at how much of the page it filled up in Madison's 4 or 5 pages for what was almost always a 5 to 6 hour session, maybe it was 30 minutes, and we're just getting Madison's 3-minute version, right, of a 30-minute debate, right? Obviously, he's not taking shorthand. He's not trying to do a transcript, right? Trying to do good, clear, accurate notes. So I want to read to you. So it's short. It's either a half an hour short or it's even 3 to 5 or 10 minutes short debate. But it's not a 2-hour debate, that we know, right, from just looking at the structure of Madison's product. So Pinckney he's from South Carolina. I'm not going to give you the background of all the delegates, there isn't time for that. But he says the first thing, so this comes up, and he gets recognized by Washington, who's the presiding officer. They stand up and then they get recognized. And he says he's opposed to vesting this power in the legislature. Its proceedings were too slow. It would meet but once a year. The House of Representatives would be too numerous for such deliberations. The original House was 65, but they knew it would quickly grow into the hundreds, as it did. The original Senate was, of course, 26, 13 states, although when it first met, had 22 because 2 states had not yet ratified, North Carolina and Rhode Island. The Senate would be the best depository, being more acquainted with foreign affairs and more capable of proper resolutions. So Pinckney would vest it in the Senate alone. And I'm skipping a little bit. Butler then says, the objections against the legislature lie in great degree against the Senate. The reasons why it would be bad for the House to have this power also would apply for the smaller Senate. Butler, was for vesting the power in the president, who will have all the requisite qualities and will not make war but when the nation will support it. All right, let's just give it to the president, the power to make war. The British king had the power to make war. So this wouldn't be the first chief executive that had the power. Madison and Elbridge Gerry, by the way, Gerry's name is known to all of us as the beginning of a longer political term. Only the term softens the G, gerrymandering. You've heard of gerrymandering? Well, that's from Elbridge Gerry. He pronounced it Gerry. He became the governor of Massachusetts. He drew legislative maps in weird forms that somebody thought looked like a salamander in order to benefit his political party. And it came into American political law as gerrymandering. Anyway, Madison and Gerry moved to insert declare, striking out make war, leaving to the executive the power to repel sudden attacks. Now, this is interesting. So they're saying make war should be shrunken at least a little bit to declare war. And they'll win on this. By a 7-3 vote, their motion will carry, and we end up with the power to declare war, not the power to make war. So what's the justification, this very brief justification? This will leave to the executive the power to repel sudden attacks. Apparently, they're concerned that if Congress has the power to make war, the president wouldn't be able on his own under the Constitution to repel a sudden attack. But Sherman, Madison always misspelled it Sharman, but it's Roger Sherman of Connecticut. Roger Sherman of Connecticut was famous for having earlier in the convention made the strongest argument that the president should be entirely subordinate to the supreme will of the society expressed in the legislature. He was alone. His was a lonely voice. There were hardly anybody else there who thought that under this new Constitution, the executive should be the mere servant, chosen at will by the legislature, kicked out of office at will by the legislature. So that's an interesting part of his background. So he says he likes it the way it stands. The executive should be able to repel and not commence war. Make is better than declare, the latter narrowing the power too much. Now, what does this mean? So he's actually disagreeing with Madison and Gerry, who think that in order to allow the president to repel sudden attacks, you have to change make war to declare war. You have to shrink it. Gerry says, on the contrary, he basically says he will have anyway the power to repel sudden attacks, even if Congress has the power to make war. And what I'm worried about, Gerry, is that you're shrinking it too much. He doesn't say how much when you go from make to declare. You're leaving too much in the hands of the president. And then Gerry, speaking on his own, referring back to Butler, says he never expected to hear in a republic a motion to empower the executive alone to declare war. And then there's a few other brief comments that we don't have to get into just to save some time. And then there's a vote, and this motion by Gerry and Madison wins 7-3. And that's where the power of Congress to declare war, that's where it comes from that vote. And there's no equivalent discussion of war powers when they go through the presidency, the commander-in-chief and these other provisions that we talked about. This is it. 3-minute to 30-minute conversation. So what are we to make of this brief debate? Let me suggest a couple of things. Well, first, we shouldn't try to make too much of it. There's only 7 who spoke. Remember, Madison said anytime somebody spoke, he wrote it down. Only 7 who spoke. They didn't speak for very long. We don't get very much detail of just what this dispute is all about. So we should be cautious about how much we can extract from this little debate. I mean, I don't know if a whole book, but whole academic articles are written about these few words from this one famous August 17th debate. You get together with a group of constitutionalists and you say August 17th, and everybody knows what you're talking about. So anyway, I would suggest there are certain things we can conclude relatively confidently. First, there was little sentiment to allow the president to simply be in charge of decisions to go to war. It was a non-starter. Butler mentions it. No one comes to his support. There's no motion that gets seconded. There doesn't seem to be any sentiment except for Butler, and maybe there's 1 or 2 others who were silent. You might be silent because you realize you have no chance of carrying the day. Anyway, there's little sentiment that we'll just let the president, like the British king had this power, can decide whether to go to war. Second point, make war, they did agree by a 7-3 vote, right, that make war was too broad a power to give to Congress, and that it should be constrained or constricted or narrowed in some way to declare war. Now, what we don't know, and we'll talk more about before we're done, what we don't know is how much did they think it was shrinking Congress's power and expanding the president's power, right? Because Sherman thought it would shrink Congress's power too much and expand the president's power too much if you made that change. But they went ahead and made that change. But notice that in narrowing Congress's power, more power went to the president, at least the power to repel sudden attacks. And Sherman feared maybe even more than that would reside with the president. So if you think about it, they haven't come to the presidency yet, but they seem to be thinking that whatever we give to Congress, we're taking away from the presidency. And if we cut down what we give to Congress, we're leaving more with the presidency. Now, if that's an accurate way to understand this brief debate, then it, in a very interesting way, it makes us think, or perhaps conclude, that they thought that the war power by its nature naturally belonged to the chief executive. Remember, this is a debate about Congress's power, not a debate directly, right, about a provision under Article 2 on the presidency. So it's useful information. It's a useful way of thinking about this very brief debate. Now, interestingly, though, this was not the first time that the leaders in the new nation had written a constitution. I'm going to leave out the Articles of Confederation, which you've all heard about, because it did not create a separate executive branch. So for this presentation tonight, I'm not even going to mention it, how it dealt with war powers. I'm actually working on a sort of big book with a former classmate and longtime friend and co-author named Gary Schmidt, who works at the American Enterprise Institute, who has spoken, I don't know if he's spoken this kind of program you have, but he's spoken at Hillsdale in the past. He and I are working on a big book this fall, and we will have a chapter on, not on war power only, but on the powers of presidency of the President and Congress. And we'll have a chapter on the Articles of Confederation, but I'm not going to mention it here. But I do want to talk about the 11 states that wrote 12 constitutions between 1776 and 1784. 15 of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention had served on the bodies that wrote those constitutions, and 5 or 6 of them were principally involved in the drafting of those state constitutions. So a lot of them had prior experience with war powers issues, but applied at the state level. So every state but Connecticut and Rhode Island wrote a new constitution, and South Carolina wrote 2, so that's how you get 12. Connecticut and Rhode Island just kept their old charter forms of government because they had elected governors, not royal governors appointed by the king. In every other state, there was a royal governor appointed by the king, and in the first year or 2 of the Revolution, those governors, those royal governors, fled or they were deposed, and so you had no body to carry out the executive power. And so what they did at first was create committees of safety to carry out the executive power. Then they wrote new constitutions, and they all created executive branches to carry out the executive power. So how had these 11 states with their 12 constitutions managed the war power in their constitutions? One thing all the states did was to make the governor the commander-in-chief. Every state made its governor the commander-in-chief, just as today the governor of Michigan is the commander-in-chief of the militia in Michigan. But notice that they did not have to do this. They could have done, they being those who wrote the state constitutions, they could have authorized the legislators to choose a commander-in-chief who was answerable to them rather than answerable to the governor. They could have done that. Just as the Continental Congress in 1775 chose George Washington to be the commander-in-chief who was answerable to it. They could have done that, but none of them did that. In every single state, even though most of the early states had powerful legislatures and weak governors, not all of them, but most of them, even those weak governors were made the commander-in-chief of the armed forces within their state. Now, at the time of the founding, the armed forces within the state would include the militia, which is all male citizens, 16 to 45, I think, able-bodied male citizens. Some states allowed free blacks to be in the militia, and some states limited it just to whites in the militia. But states also had their own regular forces, and during the Revolutionary War, some of those regular forces came under the control of the Continental Army, but some did not. So there were these military forces in the states during the Revolutionary period that the governors, every one of them was the commander-in-chief of. Now, one constitution, or one state with two constitutions, we call it up, South Carolina, did something that no other state did and that the U.S. Constitution did not do. So this is what, I'm going to read two brief provisions, one from the 1776 Constitution of North Carolina, one from the 1778, I should say. My slide says 1787, which is wrong. It was a typo. It should be 1778. So from 1776, the president and commander-in-chief. So many of the states most use this term governor, but some use the term president for what we call generally the governor of the state. The president, so the title of the governor of South Carolina in 1776 was president and commander-in-chief, shall have no power to make war or peace or enter into any final treaty without the consent of the General Assembly and Legislative Council. That was the upper chamber. So, and then in 1778, they changed the name of the president to governor. Now he's governor, commander-in-chief. He shall have no power to commence war without prior approval of the legislature. So to make war in the first one, and then to commence war. Now, interestingly, no other state put that kind of constraint on its governor, and nor did the U.S. Constitution follow that model. And maybe even more interestingly, this model was well known. In fact, I mentioned the Committee of Detail. It was 5 members. It was chaired by John Rutledge, who was the most prominent, maybe, citizen of South Carolina at the time. He had some prominent brothers as well, as Edward Rutledge and some others who had high positions. But he had been governor for 4 years in South Carolina during the Revolution. He wasn't governor in 1787, but he was the chair of this committee. So he knew exactly, so when they wrote up the draft Constitution, the committee that wrote the draft Constitution, he knew exactly how the Constitution they were writing then in Philadelphia could constrain presidential war making. But as far as we know, he never proposed that kind of constraint. And to the best of our knowledge, no one at the Constitutional Convention proposed the South Carolina type language for the U.S. Constitution. I think that's an important point. It's a point that was first made in the scholarship on these topics by a Berkeley law professor named John Yoo, Y-O-O, who's written extensively on the founding and on presidential power and worked in the second Bush administration some years ago, and is now back at Berkeley. He's the first one to really develop this very important point that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention could have restrained the president in a more emphatic way in terms of going to war if they had wanted to, because they knew the language to do it, and you were John Rutledge, they knew the South Carolina Constitution, but they didn't go that way. Now, I'm not going to read this. This is The Massachusetts Constitution, which was then really copied 4 years later by New Hampshire in its constitution, gave a vast amount of power to its commander-in-chief. And there's no time to go through this, but if any of you are particularly interested, a distinctive feature of that constitution, which is where I'm from, so I have, I guess, a little bit of native pride, is that it's the oldest written constitution still functioning in the world today. Now, it's not a national constitution, right? It's a state constitution, but it's the oldest written constitution still functioning in the world today. And if you look at the Massachusetts Constitution today, you can look it up online. Most states have thrown off their original constitutions and written new ones, but I think partly out of pride. In Massachusetts, they kept the original one. They just kept amending it several hundred times. So there's a version online that has the original with all the amendments, and there's more amendments than there is original language. But anyway, it's still this interesting point. So to this point, we've been talking about powers. But we should say a word about structure, a word more about structure. So Alexander Hamilton, so do I have, let me call up Federalist 70. So some of you, the students here and others, may have come across this language, but Federalist 70 is maybe the most important Federalist essay on the presidency. It's 67 through 77 around the presidency, and this may be the one that's the most important. But what Hamilton argues here, I'm going to summarize a bit. He says there are people who think that you can't have a vigorous executive and a Republican government together, that a Republican government doesn't allow for a vigorous executive. And Hamilton says we had better hope those people are wrong because every government needs a vigorous executive. He says, and he talks about, he uses the phrase vigorous executive and about energy in the executive. And he says energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. It is essential to the protection of the community against foreign attacks. And then he goes on to give a longer list of things where it's useful. Administrating the laws, preserving domestic order. I'll skip that. Every man the least conversant in Roman history knows how often that republic was obliged to take refuge in the absolute power of a single man under the formidable title of dictator. The Roman experience was well known to the educated American framers and the leaders. Rome was a republic from roughly 500 BC to 100 BC. The Roman Republic had a very complex set of governing institutions, different popular assemblies, different officers with different responsibilities, but it didn't concentrate power in any one person sufficiently that if a real crisis arose, domestic, like a civil war between the classes in Rome, or international, other city-states or other foreign powers, they couldn't deal with the crisis with their normal constitution. So what they did, and they did this for several hundred years, they would choose some noble, competent, respected person and make that person dictator for up to 6 months. And there are really only two limits on the power of that dictator. One was the limited time. It had to stop at 6 months. Could stop sooner. And the other was that the dictator could not order the execution of a Roman citizen. That had to be approved by the popular assembly. So the famous, he's a semi-mythic character, but the most famous dictator is someone named Cincinnatus, after whom Cincinnati is named, and you may have heard of the Society of the Officers of the Revolutionary War created a society to continue fellowship and to help support families of wounded or killed officers. And they call themselves the Society of Cincinnati. They thought of themselves as like Cincinnatus. So the story is he's plowing the field, but he has a reputation of public service. And they come and they say, we need you. And they put him in, they make him dictator. He solves the crisis and he goes back to his field. That's sort of the classic Roman understanding of working for the public good, for the things that are good for the public. Anyway, obviously the Americans reject this way of dealing with the need occasionally for vast executive power to be concentrated in one hand. But Hamilton goes on to say that if you have a feeble executive, you'll get feeble execution of government and you'll get a bad government. You must have an energetic presidency, and that means it must be unified. So it can't be a plural, like a committee of 3 or committee of 6. Pennsylvania essentially had a committee of 12 as its executive, with one of them chosen to be called president. So it couldn't be a committee executive, and it couldn't be an executive that was checked by a council that had independent authority. So most states, not quite all, but most states had a council that had to approve the actions of the governors, at least many of the actions of the governors. That unity is conducive to energy will not be disputed. Decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch, those are common qualities that are mentioned during this period, will generally characterize the proceedings of one man in a much more eminent degree than the proceedings of any greater number. And in proportion as the number is increased, these qualities will be diminished. So there's structural grounds why the president may be in a position to take the initiative to act aggressively. Remember, at the beginning of the country, Congress was more often not in session than in session. It was in session typically 6 months one year, 3 months the next. So that's 9 months out of 24. So on average, if you just pick the date at random, Congress is not in session. So things can happen, and in those days it took a while, of course, to gather Congress, because at the very beginning there was no telegraph and there were no railroads. Later, some decades later, you'll have both telegraphs and railroads, so Congress can assemble more quickly. Now, let's move ahead a few years to 1793. So, war has broken out in Europe between France and its neighbors. Word of the conflict makes its way across the Atlantic early in the year, and the Washington administration has to decide what to do. The complication was that France and the United States had a treaty from 1778, the treaty that brought France to the aid of the American revolutionaries, and maybe their aid was decisive to winning the Revolutionary War. But that treaty also had a provision that said if France in the future were at war, then the United States was obligated to protect French interests and colonies in the Caribbean. So, there isn't time to tell the whole story about this, but the key is that Washington and his cabinet, having to decide, what do we do? This was our great ally. This is the nation that probably made it possible for us to be independent. We seem to have this treaty obligation, but would it be wise for us? We don't really have a navy. How could we really carry out this obligation? So Washington and his cabinet agreed, and Washington announced publicly that the U.S. would remain neutral in the European war. On April 27th, he issued what we call his Proclamation of Neutrality. That wasn't the official title of it, but that's what we historians and others have usually called it. And so that Proclamation of Neutrality informed the nations in Europe that were at war that the U.S. was a neutral. And so neutrals under international law had certain rights that had to be respected. So if you're shipping goods from one neutral country to another neutral country across the Atlantic Ocean, the belligerents are not allowed just to capture those goods, foodstuffs or whatever, or manufactured goods, because it would be useful for their war effort. But also American citizens, so the belligerents had to know that the U.S. was neutral. But also American citizens had to know, because there was a lot of feeling for the French, and a lot of Americans wanted to help the French in its war. And if those Americans who owned ships loaded those ships with goods, food, and arms and things like that, they might be violating international law. They might be captured by the enemy, and Washington is saying to them, you can't expect I'm going to come to your aid, because we're a neutral nation, and you must respect the laws of neutrality, you as citizens, as private citizens. So this proclamation was hugely controversial. Pro-French feeling ran high in the country, not surprisingly. Congress was not in session and not scheduled to return until December of 1793. Many Americans opposed the policy of neutrality, and some questioned whether the president even had the authority to make such a decision. Writing under the pseudonym Pacificus, Alexander Hamilton, who was then the Secretary of the Treasury, wrote 7 essays defending Washington's decision as both constitutional and prudent or wise, and also as not violating the stipulations of the treaty. It's a long discussion of how to understand the treaty. I won't go into that. His first essay is on the constitutional issue. That's all I'm going to quote from here in a minute. Thomas Jefferson reads these 7 essays by Hamilton defending Washington's actions. Jefferson was, as you probably know, the Secretary of State. He supported neutrality, the policy, in the cabinet meetings. We actually have his notes from those meetings, from the cabinet meetings. He was the secretary, and he kept the notes. But when he read Hamilton's broad interpretation of presidential power, he wrote to his friend and protege, James Madison, who was not in the administration, but was a leader in the House of Representatives. And this is part of what he wrote. "For God's sakes, my dear sir, take up your pen, select the most striking heresies, and cut him to pieces in the face of the public." So Jefferson was somewhat exercised, you could say, about this defense that had been given by Hamilton. Madison, writing as Helvidius, obliged with 5 essays, all of them focused on the constitutional question. Madison didn't challenge the wisdom of the policy. He didn't challenge the way in the treaties were interpreted. All he challenged was Hamilton's first essay defending the constitutionality of this proclamation. So that's what I want to turn to then, is excerpts from Hamilton writing as Pacificus. So that Hamilton used the pseudonym Pacificus. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this, and again, since you can't see it, but just follow along as best you can. And then we'll see how adamantly Madison disagreed, and then I'm going to show one more thing and kind of bring this to a conclusion. So Hamilton writes, first, in what isn't on the slide, for those of you who can see it, first he writes that a proclamation isn't really a legislative power, it's not really a judicial power, so it must be executive, because what else is left but executive? But then he gives more information. He talks about how the executive is in charge is the organ of intercourse with other nations, he's the interpreter of national treaties, so it fits in with other expressed presidential powers. That's his first argument. But then, most importantly, he quotes the beginning words of Article 2, the vesting clause. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. And he says that all possible executive power has been given to the president unless the Constitution takes some away, unless it makes an exception. And it made 3 exceptions. It gave the Senate a role in the president making high-level executive appointments and ambassadorial appointments, who are obviously involved in foreign policy. The Senate must approve who the Secretary of State is going to be. Not people lower down in the totem pole, but people at the top. The Senate, even though they're executive offices to serve the president, the Senate must approve. So the Senate has a little bit of executive power. The Senate has to approve treaties. Hamilton's point is that otherwise the president would have the full power over treaties, but the Constitution says otherwise. And also, he says, of course, the legislature has the power to declare war and grant letters of marque and reprisal. But Hamilton's constitutional position is and this was a norm at the time, Madison denied it, but denied its application here, is that when a general power is granted and there are exceptions that are cut out, the exceptions are to be interpreted strictly, narrowly, as a general norm of interpreting a document like a constitution. So here's Hamilton's conclusion. While, therefore, the legislature can alone declare war, can alone actually transfer the nation from a state of peace to a state of war, all right, only the legislature, according to Hamilton, very pro-presidency, but according to him, only the legislature can transfer the nation from a state of peace to a state of war. It belongs to the executive power to do whatever else the law of nations cooperating with the treaties of the country enjoin in the intercourse of the United States with foreign powers. In other words, the whole power of foreign policy comes in through the vesting clause, but some of it has been carved out and given to the Senate, 2 things, and then to the full Congress, this one other big thing, the power to declare war and grant letters of marque and reprisal. Now, I'm not going to go into it, but if any of you have studied Locke's second treatise of government, so Locke was writing this famous British philosopher and political philosopher, John Locke. He was writing 100 years before these events. And in his second treatise in chapter 13, he says, there are 2 kinds of executive in principle. There's a domestic executive, carries out domestic law, and there's what you might call the international executive. who exercises conducts international relations, makes foreign policy. Locke says, you can call this the federative power, this foreign policy power. He then says, I don't really care what name you use, but it's commonly called the federative power. And then Locke said, in any well-regulated state, those two executives are brought together. You don't want to have one person with the power of the state to carry out domestic policy and a whole separate person with the power of the state to carry out foreign policy. So in all well-regulated commonwealths, you bring those together into one person. So Hamilton doesn't mention Locke, but he knew Locke, and all the leading founders knew Locke. It was essentially required reading at colleges and universities throughout the country. And Madison in particular, I'm not going to read everything from Madison, but he specifically took issue with Locke, knowing that Locke was kind of the inspiration for this Hamiltonian position. So Madison now responds after these 7 essays have come out with 5 essays of his own. And let me read a little bit. Let me put up. Okay, so Madison's writing as Helvidius. Let me read a little bit of this. The basis of Pacificus's reasoning is, we perceive, the extraordinary doctrine that the powers of making war and treaties are in their nature executive, and therefore comprehended in the general grant of executive power, where not specifically and strictly accepted out of that grant. The natural province of the executive magistrate is to execute laws, as that of the legislature is to make laws. All his acts, therefore executive, must presuppose the existence of laws to be executed. So this notion that treaty making and war making by their nature are executive is, according to Madison, completely wrong. He then, in a famous passage that's often quoted, it's, for those who can see, it's near the bottom of this slide. War is, in fact, the true nurse of executive aggrandizement. In war, physical force is to be created, and it is the executive which is to direct it. In war, the public treasures are to be unlocked, and it is the executive hand which is to dispense them. And then it goes on, and it mentions that if glory is to be had in war, it's the executive that's going to get the glory. The strongest passions, the most dangerous weaknesses of the human breast, ambition, avarice, vanity, the honorable or venial love of fame. There's a good kind of love of fame, but there's also a more venial love of fame. All are in conspiracy against the desire and duty of peace. Hence, it has grown into an axiom that the executive is the department of power most distinguished by its propensity to war. It's more the executive than the judiciary or the Congress that wants to go to war. I mean, there have been exceptions in American history, but that's the general argument. Hence, it is the practice of all states, in proportion as they are free, to disarm this propensity of its influence. So the key thing in free states is to disarm the propensity of the executive to go to war. So this is quite a contrast between these two men, one from Virginia, one from New York, who were close allies at the Constitutional Convention, who authored together all but 5 of the Federalist Papers. As you may know, Hamilton wrote the most, and Madison the next, and John Jay, who was ill, only wrote 5. Who each led the pro-Constitution forces in their respective states in the constitutional ratifying conventions, and successfully, both, of course, Virginia and New York both ratified in the summer of 1788. Yet here they are a few years later, engaged in a pretty big disagreement. You will often see in the scholarship that I cover and that I'm involved in, you will often see Madison's position quoted over and over again by contemporary scholars. However, Hamilton's position, not so much. He's almost sort of the forgotten child of this debate among these academics that write on this topic. Yet the United States Congress, when it did convene in December of 1793, it did not challenge the president on either the policy of neutrality or on the constitutional basis on which it was made. There was no constitutional investigation or challenge. Did you, Mr. President, have even the authority to do this, even if it was a good thing to do policy-wise? And there was none of that when the Congress came back. One final founding era document that I want to take a quick look at is do I have it up here? It's Bass v. Tingey. So I mentioned, we'll just look at a couple sentences. So this is the first war powers case the Supreme Court ever addressed. So this is in 1800. So we're 11 years under the new Constitution. Right? It began operating in 1789, and we're 11 years later. It was written in 87, ratified in 88, and went into effect in 89. So 11 years later, a legal issue arose from the so-called quasi-war with France of the late 1790s, sometimes called the undeclared war with France. It was a limited naval war in the North Atlantic. It wasn't a land war, and it didn't spread beyond the North Atlantic. Lasted for several years. It was not declared a war by Congress, but it was authorized in different statutes, especially that authorized the creation of new naval ships. The fighting itself was authorized by Congress with certain strictures put on what was allowed. So the question before the court was whether a war of this sort, which is not declared as a war, is it, for a court case, legally a war? In particular, when it came to applying the laws of salvage for ships captured on the high seas. The facts are very complicated, so I don't have to get into those. It would take a lot of time. But what rules of salvage do you apply? Because there's different rules that apply in peacetime and in wartime. And was this legally a war, even though it wasn't declared? Right? There was no declaration of war. It was authorized but not declared. So Bushrod Washington, in those days, 1800, this is 3 years before John Marshall joins the court. And so before Marshall joins the court, the justices typically wrote their own opinions. And then if enough agreed on one side, that was the opinion of the court. Once Marshall comes on, he promotes often unanimous opinions by the court, or relatively few, so you have a real formal statement of the court's opinion as a whole. So this is Bushrod Washington. And what he does in this excerpt from the case is he distinguishes two kinds of war, both legitimate, both legal. First is a war declared in form. So if Congress declares war, then you have war of the perfect kind. He calls that a perfect war. But Congress can also authorize a much more limited engagement, and that's imperfect war. But it's still legally a war. Okay? That's imperfect war. So where does all this get us? So I have this slide, which I was kind of proud of in putting it together. Let me just show you visually what it looks like, and then I'll tell you what it says, and then I'll just make a few final comments. So the point of the slide is this. If you look at all these materials, and obviously there's more one could look at, but I think I've given you a good overview of the key material. I think the Constitution gives us significant guidance as to who gets to exercise, who gets to go to war, who gets to authorize the use of the military by the United States. At one extreme is presidential power, and that's the power to repel sudden attacks. Everybody at the founding agreed on that. At the other extreme is Congress's power or obligation to move the nation from a state of peace to a state of war. But you can come in from those extremes and you can see situations, conditions where one side or the other might also be able to act, but not at the extreme. So Congress, we know from Bass v. Tingey, can authorize a limited war. Presumably, it can authorize reprisals, right? Because it can grant letters of marque and reprisal. The president, I would argue, but I won't explain the details of the argument, the president, I would say, also has the constitutional authority to engage in a preemptive strike. Think of the 1967, if you know anything about the 1967 Mideast war between Israel and its neighbors. Israel was convinced, and apparently rightly so, that its neighbors were going to attack it first. So it didn't wait to take the blow. It attacked its neighbors first, airfields and such, that would have been used to attack Israel. That's a pure preemptive strike, and I think you could argue the president has that power as well. Protecting American citizens in commerce was one that at the time of the founding there seemed to be recognition that under the various constitutional provisions the president had some authority there. And then in the middle here are more questionable issues where case by case you might have to decide make a judgment as to who has the authority. Treaty violations, foreign policy more generally, the promotion of vital American interests, and humanitarian interventions that might require the use of force. So with that, let me just conclude with a couple of paragraphs that will bring this together. I'll put up my blank conclusion slide, and I'll read you my conclusion. So what do we conclude? There is no avoiding the complications the separation of powers presents for American foreign policy, and in particular for the exercise of the war power. Yet the Constitution is more than just an invitation to the two political branches to struggle for control over the war power. Rather, the Constitution structures and empowers the Congress to be a representative and deliberative institution with final authority over whether to move the nation from a state of peace to a state of war. And the same Constitution created a single energetic executive and empowered it to act decisively and often secretly to protect American lives and interests in a dangerous world. In the decades after World War II, we had gotten away from the notion, this is before the time of most of you, of course, we had gotten away from the notion that Congress had to formally authorize any military actions that the president wished to undertake. That is, many people argue that Congress never had to authorize anything. The president could always just go first. So even a major engagement like the Korean War in the early 50s, which was funded by Congress and the draft was extended by Congress, so Congress supported what Truman was trying to do in the war, it was never actually authorized by Congress. Thus, when things weren't going well in Korea after a couple of years and the war became unpopular, people started calling it Mr. Truman's War. Mr. Truman's War, because the Congress hadn't, in an official way, authorized it and bought into it. Even though the later Vietnam War was authorized by Congress in the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964, that war engendered a belief among many that over the years, Congress had ceded to the president its proper constitutional responsibility to decide whether to go to war when war did not already exist. Consequently, the last three major military engagements undertaken by the United States, this is interesting and quite in contrast to Korea, have all been formally authorized by Congress. So what am I without a formal declaration of war. What am I talking about? The first Gulf War of 1991, you have formal, they're called AUMFs, Authorization for Use of Military Force. They're often resolutions, but they have full force of law. So the first Gulf War was authorized by an AUMF. The war against al-Qaeda and the Taliban regime after the attacks of 9/11 was authorized by an AUMF. And the more recent war against Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq that started in 2003 was authorized by an AUMF. Now, where the War Powers Act, or War Powers Resolution in 1973 fits into all this, obviously there's no time to discuss now. Maybe in the Q&A we can talk about it. So, very final thought. On the War Powers controversy, scholars, policymakers, and others tend to be either pro-Constitution or pro-presidency. But what we ought to be is not the advocate of one institution or the other, but rather advocates of the Constitution. We ought to be pro-Constitution, not pro-presidency or pro-Congress on these matters. And in some cases, indeed in many cases, the Constitution will side with presidential initiative without prior approval by Congress. But in others, the Constitution says to the president, you should not act unless and until Congress approves. In my view, the wisdom embedded in the Constitution's provisions never ceases to surprise. Thank you very much.